For the last month or two, I've been banging my head against the wall trying to make Magic in Dark Souls 3 fun. I think I've finally reached my conclusion with it. It's just not for me, and doesn't really fit an aggressive playstyle, which is really what I enjoy in these games. Now, there are plenty of players who do make it work, such as Lepista Nebularis and Pure Platinum Prin, both of whom stream fairly regularly on Twitch and whose relevant links can be found in the description of this video. Sadly, I am not one of these players, but the thing is, I want to be. I want to make spellcasting work. But my biggest issue overall is just spellcasting in Dark Souls 3 seems to push the player as hard as possible to a passive playstyle. And for that reason, I think changes, maybe not drastic overhauls, but changes in general need to be made to how FromSoft designs their spellcasting combat. So here's the way I see it. The spells in Dark Souls 3 seem to be vestigial to me. They seem like a leftover aspect of combat that they included in the game because all of the other Souls games had them. And since this is Dark Souls 3, it's gotta have all the old spells. But when the speed of combat increased between Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, none of FromSoft's spellcasting systems really compensated for that. I've actually had this script written for about a month, and I kept delaying it because it kept seeming like we were going to get some news on Elden Ring and maybe get some insight into how they're going to handle spells. And then that exact thing happened, so I'm glad I waited a little bit. But I've added a little bit extra to this video, basically on each point as to what needs to happen to improve spellcasting. I've also added what it looks like FromSoft is going to be doing with spellcasting in their next game, and how I think what we've seen so far will address that. So my first big issue is this. All gear and build crafting for DS3's magic system encourages passivity in some way, shape, or form. So let's say you want to make a mage build. Let's say you want to get the most damage out of your spells. Well, here's what you do. First, dump 40 to 60 points into intelligence. About another 24 or so into attunement so that you have enough mana to cast your spells. Allot at least 4 Ashen Estus for your Estus pool. Wear the Crown of Dusk. Equip the Bellowing Dragon Crest Ring, then stack that with the Young Dragon Crest Ring. Equip the Scholar's Candlestick. Get the most efficient staff for your level, that's either the Heretic Staff or the Court Sorcerer Staff. And then before casting your spells, make sure to buff your staff with the Weapon Art. So where does that leave you now? Well, now you have a very squishy mage that can only cast spells that do a lot of damage, but only if you're wearing all of the rings and all of the gear. It also really doesn't help that all of these spells can easily be reaction roll. Each spell is also limited by 2 different stats. Spells have both an FP cost and a stamina cost. And because you've probably allocated quite a few stats to attunement, intelligence, and maybe some health, you probably don't have a lot of endurance either. And you might say, well, this is Dark Souls 3. You know, they kind of stopped caring about endurance after Dark Souls 2. And that's fair. But in an invasion, you do need some endurance. You need the ability to chase down your opponent and do damage when their health is low to put them away. And here's where the biggest limiting factor for me comes into play, is that in order to keep doing damage, you have to have at least some mana. In order to refill that mana, you have to constantly stop and drink Ashen Estus. This gives your opponent a window to heal, apply another buff, or just to run away and summon their friends, but most importantly, gives them a chance to breathe. A physical build, on the other hand, only needs to refresh their stamina to continue to apply pressure, something they don't need a window to do really at all, due to how fast stamina regenerates in this game. All of these things combined make applying pressure and playing aggressive very difficult to do as a mage. You're likely pretty squishy, you don't have a lot of endurance to keep up the pressure, and every so often you have to take a step back, give your opponent a window, so that you can refill your ability to do damage. So how would I fix all of that? I think first and foremost is just to get rid of the Ashen Estus system, and to return to a limited number of casts per spell. This would be in junction with taking out all of the different just damage-related customization items and give all staffs and catalysts in general a buff. I think in RPGs, any item that just makes you do more damage is typically pretty uncreative to me. Because it's always like, well, why wouldn't I want to do more damage? You know, why would I want anything else except the ability to do more damage? And so spellcasting in Dark Souls 3 kind of has all of these rings, like the Witch's Ring, Morn's Ring, the Sun's Firstborn's Ring, that are all dedicated to just giving you like a flat 20% buff in all of their corresponding spells. And in my opinion, you really shouldn't have to wear every single damage boosting item in the game just to do comparable damage with magic. You know how strength and dex builds do a ton of damage with their builds? They just put a lot of points into strength or dexterity. Like, that's how those builds work. But for some reason, for spellcasters, you need a whole bunch of doodads just to make something work. Now, how will Elden Ring address this situation? Well, it seems like we're going to be getting both skills and spells in this game. And according to Miyazaki in a recent interview, we're going to be able to swap a lot of those skills onto different weapons. It's interesting to me that these skills and spells are mentioned in the same breath, and it kind of leads me to believe that we're going back to a single mana pool system, instead of something like limited number of casts. So obviously I'm not too thrilled about that. I really don't like how that system currently is, but I could see the system working very well if it went back to kind of how Bloodborne's bullets work, or how Spirit Emblems worked in Sekiro. Basically, everyone starts with one generous mana pool that you can increase by speccing into it with certain items or certain stats, I would imagine. But ultimately, it takes a lot of pressure off of build making when creating something like a wizard or a mage, where you can leave your mana pool kind of as is or only slightly increased, and spend those stats elsewhere for things like survivability or endurance. So the next big issue with spellcasting, in my opinion, is that having one pool of mana to cast spells from kind of prioritizes like the quote-unquote best spell in every school of magic, and this is a bit of a counterintuitive one. But the idea that FromSoft basically gave players more freedom to choose what spells they want to cast, and then that freedom then made the whole system kind of worse. Now, the main reason that this is a problem is because FromSoft does a really poor job of balancing their spells in Dark Souls 3. Why choose any other pyromancy in the game when you have Chaos Bed Vestiges? Sure, you can make an argument that Black Flame, has some advantages over Chaos Bed Vestiges, but there is no other pyromancy that travels as fast, does as much damage, or has as large of a hitbox as the dreaded CVVs. And despite several balancing patches, which included making the Dark Sword do less damage, and the Black Knight Glaive not having a true 3-hit combo anymore, they never managed to patch the worst part of CVV, which was the fact that it resets your hit stun. But every other school of magic in the game has a similar spell that is just kind of the best spell. Sorcerers have Crystal Soul Spear. Miracle casters have Sunlight Spear. Hexers, I guess they exist. They have Great Soul Dregs. They all have, one big giant pew-pew spell that does the most damage. And the only real attempt to balance this is the fact that these spells, take up more FP than other spells in that school of magic. But it's not that great of a balance. All it really does is push players to give themselves more Ashen Estus, which in turn makes them more passive because they can't survive that many hits. So when you've spec'd yourself into becoming a spellcaster, you kind of have to stand at the back of the crowd and play it safe. In Dark Souls 1 and 2 spellcasting system, they also used to gate certain very powerful spells by making them take up multiple attunement slots. This doesn't really work in Dark Souls 3, when all you're really doing is limiting the variety of spells a player can cast. A player can still cast CBVs to their heart's content, but now all you've really done is force them to pick between Black Serpent and Black Flame, which are two spells they're not going to cast anyways, because they're going to be too busy firing CBVs at whatever enemy they happen to be fighting. So how do we solve this? I'd really love to return to the old system where every single spell has a limited number of casts that is also influenced by how much attunement you have. I don't think FromSoft is ever going to make a return to that system, so I'll stop mentioning in this video outside of comparisons to how spells used to work. But I think one of the big limiting factors of spellcasting is that you have to do everything outside of the world that you're playing in. If you want to allot your Estus in DS3, you have to go to Andre specifically, and tell him how much Estus you want. And if you want to cast certain spells, you have to do it at a bonfire. And the player gets cut off from the bonfire the moment an invader spawns in their world or they enter online play. Meanwhile, builds that rely on physical weapons don't have to deal with that at all. Hell, they can change their setups on the fly. It's actually a big part of the meta these days. Any player you're fighting could suddenly pull out Gundyrs and knock you on your ass. But if you're fighting a wizard or a spellcaster in general, once you've seen 4 spells from them, that's all they have. So my proposition for this is let us do more things on the fly. If we're just pulling from a mana pool, it doesn't matter how many spells we can cast. All that matters is that it's governed by our mana pool. So we should be able to swap out spells on the fly. Say something like, Soul Greatsword isn't really doing it for you, and you wish you could hold that for just a little bit longer. You should be able to hard swap to Old Moonlight, so that you could potentially condition someone to roll in on Soul Greatsword, but then hold it for just a second longer and hit them with Old Moonlight. And speaking of doing things on the fly, I thought Bloodborne had a great solution for this, which was Blood Bullets, where you can essentially trade a portion of your health for a few more bullets to use. And this is actually a much better solution than an Ashen Estus system, where you have to go back to the hub and talk to a particular person to get your Estus allotted correctly. No, you can do it on the fly, so you don't have to constantly worry about, oh, do I have the correct amount of Estus? Am I going to get the correct Estus back when I killed this phantom or this blue? It's a much simpler solution that allows you a lot greater control over your own style of play because it's on the fly, because it can adapt to different situations that you're in. I don't always need all of my blue Ashen Estus when I fight, but it would be nice to have a little bit more here and there, and I'd gladly give up some of my own Estus to compensate for that. As for how Elden Ring can solve this, it's a little bit more complicated. On the one hand, I really like that we're going to be able to bind all these different weapon arts to almost whatever weapon we want. I'm sure there'll be some limitation on it, but I can't wait to find out more about that system. But on the other, I really don't want to have to determine exactly what weapon arts I'm going to be using at a bonfire. And the same goes for spells. I currently really don't like that I have to attune exactly what spells I'm going to use in an invasion at the bonfire, and I don't want that to be the case while I'm invading. I just want invasions to be adaptable, and if adaptability comes at the price of making any and all weapons do any and all weapon arts and skills and spells, I'm okay with that. I'd rather the game as a whole be an entire jumbled mess than us be locked into a very rigid system that lacks creativity. And if that means that any sorcerer at any point can pull out that one good spell, so be it. I would just hope that Elden Ring takes more of a page from Dark Souls 2 than Dark Souls 3, and doesn't include just one gigantic great spell in every school of magic, and instead includes a lot of other spells that perform different functions. This actually leads me directly into my next point. What exactly happened to all the unique spells that were in Dark Souls 2? In fact, if you go to the Dark Souls 2 wiki, there are 4 tabs when it comes up for magic. You have sorceries, hexes, which are specifically different than sorceries, pyromancies, and miracles. But in Dark Souls 3, it just seems like they got hexes and shoved them back into sorceries. And the only real reason, other than time constraints, that I can justify why they did this was because that's how Dark Souls 1 did it. This is disappointing because we end up losing a ton of really cool spells that we got to play with in Dark Souls 2, but also from a story perspective, it kinda doesn't make any sense. The events of Dark Souls 1 are so long forgotten by this world, right? Only a few people even remember Gwyn's name, and in Dark Souls 2, everyone's forgotten all of the gods' names. Dark Souls 2 also illustrated the state of the world with so many dark hexes and heretical sorcerers running all over the place. The player really got the sense that, yeah, Drangleic had fallen to the dark, had really fallen to the abyss, and things were pretty out of control. But in Dark Souls 3, it seems like none of that mattered, or none of that even happened. Miracles are just as strong as ever. People remember the words and the stories of Gwyn and his firstborn. We really shouldn't be remembering someone whose name was struck from the annals of history, and yet we're casting spells that do quite a bit of damage in remembrance of this unnamed son. And it'd be pretty cool if when we traveled back to Archdragon Peak that we found all these old lightning miracles, and that would be like a cool Easter egg. It's like, of course, all the old lightning miracles can be found in a time that took place long ago. But instead we kind of find them throughout the game, and especially all over Lothric. And it doesn't really reflect the state that Lothric is supposed to be in, which is a kingdom at war with itself, and is slowly rotting and decaying away, with all of the pus of man all over the place. It really doesn't reflect that in its spellcasting system, which is a bit of a nitpick, obviously, but it's something that Dark Souls 2 did really well. Alright, now that the lore rant is out of the way, I can finally make my case about what's wrong with the variety of spells in Dark Souls 3. And it really boils down to the fact that most of the spells in every single category of magic are just pew-pews. A projectile that travels in a fairly straight line and then does damage at the end of it. In Dark Souls 2, we had two sorceries, Soul Flash, that punished players for rolling into sorcerers, and we had Soul Geyser, which did the same thing but maybe at a range, and had different projectiles on different paths. And Dark Souls 3 attempts to make its own unique spells. We have stuff like Fair and Flash Sword, Flame Fan, Floating Chaos, and Divine Pillars of Light. The only problem is, all these spells suck. You have these really unique spells with really unique animations, and they don't do any damage. And you know what does really good damage in this game? Pew-Pews. That's kind of the heart of the issue here, is that the Pew-Pews do damage. They encourage you to stand all the way at the back of the party, firing them from a distance, and never engaging. And the spells that maybe require you to get up in people's faces, or get people to roll into you, those spells don't really do any damage, or they never hit their targets. You'll see me use Fair and Flash Sword on just a slightly spec'd out mage in this video, and it does 90 damage. 90 damage at SL72. The thing is, I might as well just use a straight sword for that purpose. It will do more damage, take up less stamina, have a faster swing speed, and it won't take away an attunement slot. A straight sword is better than Fair and Flash Sword in quite possibly every way you can imagine. So that's just kind of my beef with unique spells in Dark Souls 3 that aren't just pew-pews, is it seems like they were too afraid to introduce some unique spells that are just going to be way too overpowered or way too hard to deal with. So they were just very content with making those unique spells do so little damage that they were completely useless. That even if those spells were impossible to dodge, nobody would really mind because they don't do any damage. Which is kind of a total bummer, because we have weapons like the Split Leaf, or the Arcade Pugs, or Gales that were all introduced in the DLC that all have some gross wombo combo. But new DLC spells that really change the game, pretty much just Lightning Arrow, which is a pew-pew that you can hold until you want to fire it. That's the advantage there. What would be not a very hard way to balance spells a little bit more is just make those unique spells do a lot of damage. Something like Flame Fan, oh my god. Something like Flame Fan could be deserving of a very large buff, because it doesn't come out that fast. You kind of have to risk a lot to land it, and you really need the Sage Ring +2 or some other tool that increases spellcasting speed to use it. But so you risk quite a bit to get in there and cast Flame Fan, and then it does about 2 straight sword hits worth of damage, which isn't a lot. You need a lot more to risk that much for something that casts a little bit slow. If Flame Fan did a lot of damage, especially on that second hit where you get instability frames, people would use it a lot more often, but you never see it because it's risky, it's slow, and it doesn't do a lot of damage. And that third one is always the biggest deal. It doesn't do a lot of damage. Why would I waste an attunement slot on Flame Fan when I can have Chaos Bed Vestiges or Black Flame? Same goes for Fair and Flash Sword. If Fair and Flash Sword outdamaged Great Soul Arrow, I think you'd see a lot more people using that. But it doesn't. It does less damage than Great Soul Arrow and requires you to be up in your opponent's face, which, as we all know for a mage, is a very bad idea. If we gave more of these unique spells, more area denial and close range spells, buffs that did actual damage, people would use them more. People are always looking for something that does a lot more damage, even if it changes up their playstyle. The reason mages are so passive is because the entire system pushes them to be passive. But if we gave them reasons to do damage up close to other players and be aggressive, I'm confident they would do that as well. In terms of what Elden Ring is going to do to address this problem, I think what we have so far, what we've seen so far, bodes well. There seems to be quite a few unique spells so far in the trailer. Soulstream seems to be coming back, which I thought was, one of the cooler ways to handle pew-pews. But we also saw a boss throwing out this big ethereal hammer. The player uses this overhand, Soul Greatsword meets Dark Edge, but somehow cooler spell, or it might be a weapon art, I don't quite know yet. We also have some sort of leaping Fair and Flash Sword slash with a glaive too that we saw. The leak trailer from March also had some spells in it, like this kind of soul spear, but from the hand, that's striking one of these centipede kind of demons. We do know that Crystal Homing Soul Mass is coming back, which really, of the pew-pews to bring back, is really not that bad. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-pew-pews across the board. I just don't want that to be the most effective strategy for spells in Elden Ring. Something that's more DS3 specific than anything else is that weapon catalyst hybrids in Dark Souls 3 are weirdly hard to use. So there are 6 weapon catalyst hybrids in the game. There's the Demon Scar, Cleric's Candlestick, Heiselpick, Golden Ritual Spear, Immolation Tinder, and the Rose of Ariandel. Of these hybrid catalysts, only 2 of them have a true combo into a spell that does more damage than the weapon's second R1. And in a game where the hit stun is based around a 2-hit combo system, that's just a severe lack of synergy. Of those 6 catalysts, 3 of them, which are the Cleric's Candlestick, Golden Ritual Spear, and Immolation Tinder, demand investment from stats that have 0 scaling with the weapon at all. And let's just single out the Immolation Tinder for a quick second just to mock its ridiculous stat requirements. The Immolation Tinder requires 18 Strength, 18 Dexterity, 12 Intelligence, and 12 Faith. This is just a really weird one to me because no other halberd requires this much dex and this much strength to wield, and this is not even meant to be wielded by strength or dex users. It's a weapon for mages, so why does it have such high physical stat requirements? This weapon is just very hard to use. It's hard to put on a build that isn't already specialized for this particular weapon. So as you might imagine, these weapons don't have particularly good spell buffs for their spellcasting abilities, and that makes sense. You don't want the most powerful spellcasting tool in the game to be something that also doubles as a weapon. But at the same time, the spell buffs on these hybrid catalysts are incredibly low. I think much lower than they need to be, and that just makes it hard to do any sort of real damage with the spells cast from that hybrid catalyst. I feel like hybrid catalysts are a great way for people to play aggressive with spells. You saw that happen with the Heiselpick, and you see a good amount of Demon Scar, but these other 4 weapons barely get touched at all, and I think the big reason for that is all of the superfluous stat requirements, and the fact that their spell buff is just way too low. The solution to this seems a little bit self-explanatory. Give hybrid catalysts a buff in their spell buffs, get rid of their weird stat requirements, and give them a few more true combos into something a little bit more powerful. I'm not asking you to make the Cleric's Candlestick R1 true combo into Crystal Soul Spear, but it would be nice if it true comboed into something that wasn't just Fair and Flash Sword, or maybe Fair and Flash Sword would do a tiny bit more damage. Another thing I'd love to see the hybrid catalysts have are weapon arts that are actual spells. For example, the Immolation Tinder has a weapon art called Punitive Flame, which is basically Black Serpent except it does fire damage. This basically allows you to have 2 spells queued up at any time. You have whatever spell you've tabbed to in your attunement slots, but you also have your weapon art ready to go at just the press of a button. So now you have a weapon catalyst that has 3 possible moves. It can fire a spell, do the weapon art, or press R1. Meanwhile, the Cleric's Candlestick's weapon art is just a candlestick. It lights up. That's seriously the weapon art. And lastly, this is a very minor thing, but I would really love it if the catalysts in this game didn't look like crappy pieces of metal. This is a bit strange to ask, but in Dark Souls 2 we had Blue Flame, right? What a cool weapon that was. And we also had the Pilgrim Spontoon. You know, very stylish weapons. And we have the Heiselpick in Dark Souls 3, and it looks like a crappy piece of metal with some cloth covering it. We have the Cleric's Candlestick, which looks like the Deacons of the Deep sat on it before they transposed it into their boss soul. It is a bit of a nitpick, but people want to use weapons that look cool, and none of the hybrid catalysts in this game look even remotely appealing to use. And so that's kind of how I hope Elden Ring will handle having skills and spells tied to weapons. But especially I hope that Elden Ring allows us to tie weapon skills and like weapon arts to catalysts themselves. Really love it if you could use something like Impact, that's the weapon art for crossbows, which basically slams you into the person in front of you to create space. If we could have something like that on catalysts to create a little bit of space, or to get aggressive opponents off you for just a second so you can cast another spell without being interrupted. But ultimately, I think the best solution would be giving players the options to tie actual spells to weapons instead of weapon arts, or even better, a mix of both. I think it'd be really cool to do something like the Old Wolf Curved Sword backflip, and then cast the spell directly out of that. I think this synergy between weapons, weapon arts, and spells would all create for like a really creative community around making builds. I just think the variety, the combinations, and all the different possibilities would be a huge boon to people like me who really enjoy making these these kind of weird off-meta builds. And who knows, this could also spawn a lot of its own metas. Meta tactics are born from experimentation, and the more variety you give us means like the more things that can be drawn out of a system or morphed into like legitimately viable and good tactics. There's a lot we still don't know about how Elden Ring is really going to handle swapping weapon arts and spells onto certain weapons and catalysts, but I'll be really interested to find out. The final aspect that I would change about spellcasting in Dark Souls 3, and just Dark Souls as a whole, is the fact that we have to toggle through every single spell that we want to cast. If you have a lot of attunement and you've attuned a lot of spells, it's a whole game within itself to manage all those different spells in the orders that they've been attuned. And with all the other systems that you have to manage, like mana, stamina, and HP, here's just yet another system to manage on top of that. And it's a little too much and makes the whole thing pretty unintuitive. And if you just compare that to physical weapons, it's incredibly easy to have a ton of different movesets at your disposal. Any given weapon has R1s, R2s, and weapon arts, and perhaps even a different moveset entirely if you two-hand it. Spells, on the other hand, have R1, and that's it. There are 3 spells in this game that have rolling and running attacks, as well as just the standard R1s. That's Fair and Flash Sword, which does no damage, and Fair and Dart, which also does no damage, and Great Fair and Dart, which also does no damage. It's such a shame that 3 spells, and really just 2 spells that have running and rolling R1s, don't do any real damage, and are kind of inconsequential. A viable solution to this would be to give most weapons more movesets when attuned. Now, every single weapon doesn't necessarily need an R1, R2, rolling R1, and a rolling R2, etc. But it would be nice to see more of that where it makes sense to do so. I also think giving all catalysts their own spell that you can just use as a weapon art at all times is also something that would fix this problem. Catalysts such as the Storyteller's Staff or the Preacher's Right Arm all have their own weapon arts that basically act as a separate spell you didn't need to attune, and they're at your disposal whenever you want. I especially like the Preacher's Right Arm weapon art just because it kind of punishes players who want to roll into me. If more catalysts had those sorts of weapon arts, they'd be a lot more dangerous because they could cast a lot more spells at any given point in the fight instead of having to tab through all the spells that you've attuned every single time you want to select something. As for how Elden Ring is going to handle this, I'd really love to see spells have R1s, R2s, and maybe some running R1s. And given that a lot of the spells they've shown us so far have melee attacks, I think that's a strong possibility. Ultimately, we're just going to have to wait and see. I think the big defining factor will be the network test, whenever that happens. Dark Souls 2 had a network test, Dark Souls 3 had a network test, and Dark Souls Remastered had a network test, so I'm assuming sometime in the next month or two we'll be able to at least get a glimpse of how spellcasting is going to work based off of the starting sorcerer kind of class. But that will all be in the future, and I'm really looking forward to see what we're actually going to get. So those are kind of my thoughts on spellcasting and how they can be improved in From Software's games, either in Elden Ring or in the future games they might make. Although I will ask you to keep this in mind, I'm extremely biased. Like any piece of media that you consume, consider where this point of view comes from. I, for example, am an insane person still playing a 5-year-old game, and only now am I deciding to really rip into its spellcasting system. A lot of these thoughts regarding spellcasting I've had since very early in the game's lifecycle, but some of these might indeed be warped by my senile mindset when it comes to this game. When you play a single game for a very long time, you stop considering what's best for new players and start to only think about what's best for you, the player that you are right now, and you don't necessarily think about the journey of how you became this player. I've tried to remove a lot of that from this video and make these suggestions seem fun and accessible for newer players, hell, just even PvE players. I want spellcasting to at least have some sort of parity with physical weapons, and it's something that's really been lacking in Dark Souls 3. Ultimately, I'd really hate for that to be the trend from now on in FromSoft games, where spellcasting falls by the wayside and is eventually just eliminated because it's never going to be as good. And some of you might say, well, if spellcasting was so good, everyone would just default to spellcasting. PvP would just become a giant mess, and everyone just be flinging spells at each other. And I'd say, first of all, PvP has always been, and will always be, a gigantic mess. The R1 button and playing passive will always be the dominant strategy in these games unless something radically different is implemented. So why not add some real magical flavor to it, at the very least? We saw a little bit of this in Dark Souls 2, and I thought it was pretty great. It adds so much flavor to the world to have all these hexers and different builds running around, whereas Dark Souls 3 seems to be nothing but straight swords and passive claymore sweaty nerds. I'd love to see a return to smart spellcasters, or people who don't even really know what they're doing, finding some viability in spellcasting. So if you disagree with me on some of these suggestions, please let me know in the comments or even on my Discord. We've been talking a ton about spellcasting and how it can be improved in Elden Ring, and honestly, I'd love more insight into what you guys might think. I think more ideas will breed more interesting discussion, and that's really what's going to tide us over until the launch of Elden Ring in 7 months. So that all being said, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.